Story 1. The Silent Watcher. The doll had always been there, sitting silently on the mantelpiece of my grandmother's old house, with her porcelain face frozen in an eerie smile, her black, glassy eyes staring endlessly into the distance. My grandmother would tell me stories about the doll, warning me never to touch it, never to disturb it, but as a child, I thought they were just tales to keep me from playing with her fragile toys. Years passed, and I never gave it much thought, until I inherited that house after my grandmother passed away. It was an eerie winter evening when I found myself alone in the house, feeling that strange pull to the living room where the doll sat, untouched for years. Something was different that night, though. The air around the doll felt colder, heavier, as if it were watching, waiting for something to happen. My fingers reached out involuntarily, brushing against her cracked porcelain cheek, and an icy chill shot up my arm, numbing it instantly. Then, the room grew darker, as if the walls themselves were closing in, and a faint whisper filled the silence. Asterisk, you're not supposed to be here. Asterisk, her eyes, once dull and lifeless, seemed to glisten with a dark, almost malevolent shine, and before I knew it, the house was filled with the sounds of tiny footsteps echoing through the walls. Desperate, I tried to back away, but my feet felt glued to the floor as her small, delicate hands started to twitch, the fingers curling and uncurling as if beckoning me closer. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, taking shape, becoming the forms of children, each one with hollow eyes and frozen smiles, mimicking the doll's unblinking stare. As I looked around in terror, I realized each shadow had something in common. They were all missing something, a part of themselves, an eye, a finger, a patch of hair, like dolls discarded and broken. The whispers grew louder, swirling in my head as the doll began to move, her head tilting ever so slowly in my direction. And then she spoke again, her voice like the scraping of nails on glass. Asterisk, you can't leave. Not until you've joined us. Asterisk, a searing pain shot through my chest as the room spun, the shadows merging, the whispers becoming a deafening roar. My last memory before blacking out was of her hollow eyes, staring into mine, as if stealing the life from my soul. I woke up in a cold sweat, back in my own bed, unsure if it had all been a dream, until I looked down and saw the tiny porcelain finger lying next to me on the pillow, a piece of her still watching, still waiting. Story 2. The Whispering Doll. My sister warned me about the doll when I first brought it home, but I shrugged it off as paranoia. I had found her in an antique shop, a delicate, glass-eyed doll with a lace dress and a mop of curly brown hair, just lying in a dusty corner, marked down as if no one wanted her. The shop owner seemed relieved when I bought her, muttering something about strange things happening, but I didn't think twice. That night, though, as I settled her on the bookshelf in my room, something felt wrong. I tried to sleep, but faint whispers pulled me back from the edge of sleep, an eerie, rhythmic chant repeating in the silence. Find me, find me. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but when I opened my eyes, there she was sitting on the edge of my bed, her eyes gleaming under the moonlight, a sinister glint that sent shivers down my spine. My room was empty, my family asleep, yet the whispers persisted, each one growing louder, more insistent. Her lips, once painted in a delicate smile, seemed to move ever so slightly, curling into something darker, almost human. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, and I couldn't move, as if paralyzed under her gaze. The air grew colder, and I could feel her tiny, invisible fingers brushing against my skin, trailing up my arm with a chilling touch that felt like ice and fire all at once. The room around me seemed to fade as the whispers intensified, filling my mind until I could no longer think of anything but her. Her voice echoed in my head, growing sharper, more urgent, until I felt a sudden, searing pain in my hand. I glanced down, horrified to see a small cut, perfectly straight and deep, as if made by an impossibly sharp blade. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. She was back on the shelf, motionless, her painted lips frozen in their eerie smile, as if nothing had happened. But when I looked closer, I saw the faintest red stain on her tiny hand, a trace of my own blood, smeared across her delicate fingers. She was no ordinary doll. She was something else, something waiting, something whispering secrets only she could hear. Story Title 3: The Dollmaker's Curse. It all began when I moved into the abandoned house on Briar Lane, an old Victorian mansion with a reputation for unsettling events. The neighbors whispered about its history, but I dismissed their warnings, brushing off the ghostly tales as nothing more than local folklore. The house, after all, was beautiful: grand wooden doors, intricate stained glass windows, and endless rooms that echoed with an eerie silence. But there was one room that unsettled me from the moment I saw it: a tiny, dimly lit workshop hidden away on the third floor. The previous owner, I was told, had been a renowned doll maker, known for creating lifelike dolls so unsettlingly realistic that some swore they moved on their own. Drawn by an inexplicable urge, I unlocked the workshop's door on the first night, feeling a strange pull toward the secrets it held. Inside, I found rows upon rows of dolls, each one sitting neatly on shelves, their eyes glinting in the dim light like they were watching me. They varied in size, shape, and expression, but all shared one disturbing trait: a lifelike quality that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. I felt as though hundreds of tiny eyes were locked onto me, their faces frozen in expressions that ranged from innocent curiosity to twisted grins that hinted at something darker lurking within. I felt a chill creep up my spine, yet I couldn't pull myself away. One doll in particular caught my attention: a small girl with curly blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, her dress a vibrant shade of crimson that looked almost fresh, as though it had been painted in blood. As I reached out to touch her, a sudden, searing pain shot through my hand, forcing me to pull back. I looked down, horrified to see a small cut on my palm, fresh and bleeding, as though the doll had somehow scratched me. The room seemed to darken, the shadows deepening as a soft, whispering sound filled the air, an unintelligible murmur that seemed to come from all around. I stumbled back, desperate to leave, but the door had somehow closed behind me, trapping me in that claustrophobic space filled with hundreds of unblinking eyes. The whispering grew louder, morphing into a sing-song voice that echoed through the room, calling my name in a sweet, childlike tone that sent shivers down my spine. "Come play with us," it beckoned, the words wrapping around me like a cold embrace, filling my mind with images of children, lifeless and frozen, their faces painted with expressions of terror as they stared blankly into the void. My heart raced as I backed away, but the dolls seemed to shift, subtly rearranging themselves on the shelves, their eyes following my every move. Then, without warning, the crimson-dressed doll's head turned ever so slightly, her glassy eyes meeting mine with a malevolent gleam. She smiled, a twisted, unnatural smile that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of her porcelain face, cracking the delicate paint as it widened into something grotesque. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat as she began to move, her tiny, delicate hands reaching out toward me, her fingers curling and uncurling in a beckoning gesture. "Stay with us forever," she whispered, her voice soft yet laced with a sinister edge that made my blood run cold. The room grew colder, the air thick with an oppressive weight that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I felt my vision blur as a strange, dreamlike sensation washed over me, pulling me deeper into a state of numbness. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, as though invisible hands were holding me in place, forcing me to stay. And then, in the dim light, I saw them, ghostly figures of children, each one with a vacant, lifeless expression, their eyes hollow and empty, yet somehow full of unspeakable sorrow. They reached out toward me, their tiny hands cold and clammy, gripping my arms with a strength that belied their fragile appearances. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey, trapped in a paralysis of fear as the doll in crimson whispered softly in my ear, her voice a chilling lullaby that seeped into my mind, clouding my thoughts and filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread. "You belong to us now," she murmured, her voice fading into a faint, echoing whisper as the world around me darkened, the faces of the dolls merging into a sea of porcelain masks, each one twisted into a grotesque smile that mocked my helplessness. I could feel my consciousness slipping away, my vision narrowing to a pinprick as the last thing I saw was the doll's cold, glassy eyes staring into mine, capturing my soul in a gaze that promised eternal torment. When I awoke, I was no longer in my own body, but trapped within the shell of a doll, my limbs stiff and unyielding, my mouth frozen in a silent scream. I could see the room around me, could feel the presence of other trapped souls nearby, each one bound to their porcelain prisons, forced to watch in silence as the dollmaker's curse claimed yet another victim. I was now one of them, forever watching, forever silent, a helpless witness to the horrors that would continue, my soul bound to that cursed workshop, my fate sealed in the hollow eyes of the doll that had once watched me. Story 4. The Doll in the Attic. I never believed the stories about our attic until that summer, the summer everything changed. We had just moved into my grandmother's old house, a creaky Victorian home that had been passed down for generations, each room heavy with the memories of the past. My grandmother had always warned me never to go up into the attic. She claimed it was a place for shadows. But I was young, curious, and full of that invincibility only youth can afford. Late one night, unable to sleep, I felt the undeniable pull to explore, as though something was calling to me from above. The old staircase leading to the attic was narrow and steep, each step creaking under my weight, amplifying the silence around me. The air grew colder with every step, and by the time I reached the top, a chill had settled into my bones. But I pressed on, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. At the far end of the attic, illuminated by a single shaft of moonlight, sat a doll, unmoving, forgotten, yet somehow alive with an energy that made my skin crawl. She was a small, delicate doll with long black hair, pale skin, and eyes that seemed to glisten, even in the darkness. Her dress was simple, faded over time, and her tiny hands rested delicately on her lap as if she were waiting for someone. As I moved closer, I noticed something strange. Her eyes seemed to follow me, shifting ever so slightly each time I moved. My heart pounded, but I couldn't look away, compelled by an unseen force to reach out, to touch her cold, porcelain face. The moment my fingers brushed her cheek, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me, a bone-deep terror that froze me in place. Her eyes seemed to darken, her expression shifting subtly into something sinister, a silent warning that filled my mind with images of shadows, lost souls, and horrors I could barely comprehend. I tried to pull my hand back, but it was as though my fingers were glued to her face, bound by some malevolent force that wouldn't let go. In the silence, I heard it, a soft, faint whisper, almost like a child's voice, yet twisted, hollow, echoing through the room as if it came from another world. "Why did you come here?" the voice murmured, filling the air with a chilling tone that seemed to seep into my bones. I could feel her gaze intensify, her glassy eyes drilling into my soul, unearthing memories, fears, and secrets I had long buried. The walls around me began to close in, and I felt trapped, caught in the doll's unyielding grip, unable to move or breathe as her voice grew louder, more insistent, filling my mind with a cacophony of whispers, each one blending into a chorus of torment. My vision blurred as the shadows in the room seemed to take shape, forming figures that loomed over me, their faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. The doll's tiny hand moved ever so slightly, her fingers curling around mine with a grip that was far too strong, far too real for something so small and fragile. I tried to scream, to pull away, but her grip tightened, and I felt my strength slipping, my consciousness fading as her eyes pulled me deeper into the darkness. The last thing I saw before the world went black was her face, smiling, her eyes glinting with a cold, malevolent light that promised endless suffering. When I finally awoke, I was alone in the attic, my hand icy cold, my mind filled with fragmented memories of nightmares too horrific to recall. But the doll was gone, leaving only an empty space where she had once sat, as if she had never been there at all. Yet I could still feel her presence, lingering in the shadows, watching, waiting, a constant reminder of the horrors I had unwittingly unleashed. I never went up to the attic again, but even now, I hear her soft whisper in the dead of night, calling my name, her voice filled with an eerie longing that chills me to my very core. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, I feel her fingers brushing against my skin, a reminder that she's still there, waiting for the day I return to the shadows, bound forever to her dark and twisted world. Story 5. Whispers of the Rag Doll. The rag doll arrived mysteriously one winter morning, left on our doorstep without a note or sender, wrapped in an old, tattered cloth that smelled of mildew and smoke. She was unlike any doll I'd ever seen, with her mismatched button eyes, one a bright blue, the other a faded brown, and her stitched, torn mouth that twisted into a perpetual, sinister smile. Her faded red dress was patched and torn, stained with blotches that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Against every instinct, my mother took her in, placing her on the mantel in our living room. From the moment she entered our home, an unsettling quiet seemed to settle over everything. The usual warmth of our house was replaced by a damp, heavy chill that lingered, casting eerie shadows across the walls even in the midday light. But it was her eyes that haunted me most. Those mismatched buttons seemed to follow me everywhere, watching, waiting, as if she were studying me with a hidden malice. My mother was oblivious, brushing off my unease as childish imagination, but I knew something was wrong. At night, strange noises echoed through the house, soft, shuffling footsteps, the creak of a rocking chair moving by itself, and sometimes, in the dead silence, a faint, high-pitched giggle that made my blood run cold. I would lie awake, listening, my heart pounding as I felt her presence near me, lurking just beyond the edge of my bed, her button eyes glinting in the darkness. One night, I gathered the courage to confront her, tiptoeing into the living room, the floorboards groaning underfoot as I approached the mantel. The air grew thick with a suffocating cold as I drew near, and I saw her smile widen ever so slightly, her stitched mouth stretching into a grotesque grin that made my stomach twist with fear. I reached out, intending to throw her out once and for all, but as my fingers brushed against her rough, worn fabric, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me, freezing me in place. I heard a whisper, soft and sinister, echoing from within her, words I couldn't fully understand, but that filled me with a terror unlike anything I'd ever felt. "You can't leave me," the voice hissed, low and mocking, as though she knew every one of my darkest secrets, my hidden fears. Her eyes glinted, and I felt a cold hand close around my wrist, pulling me closer, binding me to her with an invisible force. Shadows crept from the corners of the room, swirling around us like a thick fog, and I could see faces, pale, lifeless faces of children, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. They reached out, their hands cold and clammy, brushing against my skin as I struggled to breathe, their voices blending into a chilling chorus that filled my mind, drowning out my thoughts. "Stay with us," they whispered, their words wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. My vision blurred as the world around me faded into darkness. The last thing I saw was the doll's twisted smile, her button eyes gleaming with a malevolent satisfaction. When I woke, I was lying on the cold floor, the house silent and empty, the doll gone as though she had never been there. But I could still feel her presence, lingering in the shadows, her voice echoing in my mind, a constant reminder of the horrors I had witnessed. I knew then that she wasn't gone, that she would return, her whispers haunting me for the rest of my days, binding me to her dark world of shadows and despair. Story 6. The Doll That Wept. I didn't believe the rumors when I first heard them, the stories of the crying doll that haunted the village. They were nothing more than superstitions, whispered among the old folks and passed down like a ghost story meant to scare children. But everything changed when I found her. It was an unusually cold evening when I stumbled across the doll, lying abandoned in an overgrown patch of the woods behind my grandmother's house. At first, I thought it was a piece of discarded garbage, a child's forgotten toy left to rot in the weeds. But then I saw her eyes, large, glassy, and full of sorrow. She was dressed in a delicate white lace gown, her porcelain skin cracked in places, her hair matted and tangled like she had been through a storm. Her face was expressionless, yet there was something deeply unsettling about the way she lay there, as though she was waiting for someone to pick her up. Despite every instinct telling me to leave her alone, I couldn't resist. I reached out and carefully picked her up, feeling an odd, cold weight in my arms. As I stood up, brushing off the dirt and leaves, I thought I heard a faint sound, like a soft sobbing. It was so quiet I thought it was my imagination, but as I began walking back to the house, the sound grew clearer, so soft, so distant, but unmistakable. The doll, I realized, was crying. When I returned to the house, I placed her on the windowsill, thinking it might be some sort of prank or maybe a strange coincidence. But as the days went on, the weeping continued. Every night, without fail, the sound of soft sobs would fill the room. It wasn't just a noise, though. It felt like a presence, like something was watching me from the corners of my room. The doll's crying grew louder, more desperate, as if she was trapped in some eternal sorrow, begging to be freed. But it wasn't until one night, while lying in bed, that I saw her eyes, those sorrowful eyes, move. At first, I thought I was imagining it, too tired and too scared to make sense of what I had just witnessed. But then it happened again, more clearly this time. The doll's eyes, those lifeless, empty eyes, shifted towards me, locking onto my gaze. A chill ran down my spine, and the crying grew louder, echoing through the room like a painful wail of anguish. My heart raced, and my skin crawled as the air around me seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. The cries of the doll now seemed to form words, broken and guttural, like the voice of something long forgotten. "Help me," she whimpered, her voice a low, trembling whisper that pierced the silence of the room. "Please, help me." My hands trembled as I reached for her, but the moment I touched her cold, porcelain face, I felt a jolt of energy surge through my body, as though something powerful was trying to break free from the doll's frame. The tears that had been trickling from her eyes, thick, black tears, began to spill faster, pooling at the base of the windowsill in a dark, inky puddle. Her sobs grew louder, becoming unbearable until I was drowning in them. Then came the laughter, a twisted, maniacal cackle that came from deep within the doll. It was then that I realized the crying wasn't sorrow. It was a trap, a curse, wrapped in porcelain and lace, designed to lure anyone who found her into her web of madness. I tried to run, but the room seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in as I struggled to breathe, my vision blurry from the tears now flooding the room. The doll's face twisted into a grotesque, mocking grin, and her eyes gleamed with a malevolent gleam as she whispered one final, chilling word: "Stay." The world around me seemed to disintegrate, and I felt myself falling, pulled into the darkness, into a place where the cries of the doll would echo forever. When I woke, I was back in my room, alone, but the doll was gone. The sobs had ceased, and the oppressive weight that had filled the air lifted. But the silence was worse than any noise. The kind of silence that comes after something has been taken, after something has been lost forever. Days passed, and I never spoke of it again, but I could still hear her crying at night, soft at first, then growing louder and louder, as if the doll was still somewhere out there, waiting for me to return, waiting to claim me. And every night, as the sound of the crying echoed in my mind, I would look into the darkness, praying that she would never find me again. Story 7. The Dollmaker's Curse. I had always been fascinated by antiques, particularly dolls. They held a certain allure for me, as if each one contained a story, a piece of history frozen in time. So, when I heard about an old doll maker who lived on the outskirts of town, a man known for creating the most lifelike, intricate dolls anyone had ever seen, I couldn't resist paying him a visit. The locals spoke of him in hushed tones, warning that his dolls were unlike anything you'd find anywhere else. They whispered that there was something unnatural about them, something wrong that made people feel uneasy in their presence. But I dismissed it all as superstition until I saw his creations for myself. The workshop was tucked away in a dilapidated building, its wooden walls sagging with age, the roof covered in moss. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of old wood and varnish filled my nose as I stepped through the creaking door. The doll maker sat hunched over a workbench, his gnarled hands moving with precision as he sculpted a new doll. He looked up at me with sharp, piercing eyes, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his weathered hat. "Ah, a collector," he rasped, his voice crackling like dry leaves. "You've come for one of my dolls, haven't you?" I nodded, my heart racing with excitement. His dolls were said to be unrivaled, each one a masterpiece of craftsmanship. As I glanced around the room, I saw them, dozens of dolls, lined up on shelves, their glassy eyes staring back at me. They were beautiful, yet there was something unsettling about them. Their expressions were lifelike, too lifelike, as though they were trapped in a moment of frozen emotion. Some appeared to smile, others seemed to frown, but all of them had the same haunting, empty gaze that followed me no matter where I stood. The doll maker saw me studying them and chuckled softly. "They're not just dolls," he said, his voice low and secretive. "Each one carries a piece of the soul of its creator. A fragment of life, if you will. I give them a piece of myself, and they give me a piece of them." I was intrigued, but I didn't fully understand what he meant. I could see the pride in his eyes as he spoke, his love for his craft evident in every word. But then, as my gaze lingered on one particular doll, I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. She was different from the others. Her face was more detailed, more expressive, with a pair of deep brown eyes that seemed to hold a secret, a sorrow, hidden behind them. The doll was dressed in an old-fashioned lace gown, her hair arranged neatly in soft waves. But it was her eyes that captivated me. They were far too real, far too full of emotion. "Ah," the doll maker said, noticing my focus. "That one is special. She's my finest work. Her name is Evelyn." He smiled a crooked, unsettling smile, and I felt an involuntary shiver run down my spine. "But you should be careful," he added, his tone turning serious. "Evelyn isn't like the others. She's different. You might feel something strange when you look into her eyes." I was both intrigued and unsettled by his words, but I couldn't resist. I had to have her. I asked him how much she cost, and the doll maker told me a price so high that it made my heart skip a beat. But I was determined. I had to own her, to bring her home, to make her part of my collection. When I left the workshop that day, Evelyn was in my arms, her eyes staring at me, following my every movement as I walked through the streets. That night, as I placed her on a shelf in my study, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in the room felt heavier, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. And the silence, it was deafening. No sound from the outside world, just the echo of my breathing and the soft, rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall. I turned to Evelyn, her eyes locked on mine, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw her blink. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stepped closer, my fingers trembling as I reached out to touch her face. As soon as my fingers brushed against her porcelain skin, a jolt of electricity shot through my body, and I recoiled in shock. But then, as if nothing had happened, the room grew still again. The next few days were a blur of strange occurrences, objects moving when no one was around, whispers in the air that I couldn't explain, and an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to hang over me like a storm cloud. But it wasn't until I woke one night to the sound of a voice calling my name that I truly understood the depth of Evelyn's curse. Her voice was soft, a whisper that seemed to come from deep within the doll. "Help me," it begged. "Please help me." I couldn't move, couldn't speak, paralyzed by fear as I stared at her. Her eyes were no longer empty. They were full of rage, full of pain, as though she were begging for release from whatever dark force had trapped her inside that porcelain shell. The room around me began to shake, the walls groaning and creaking, as if the house itself was alive and angry. And then, with a violent snap, Evelyn's head turned, her eyes never leaving mine. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as a dark, shadowy figure seemed to emerge from her form, stretching, reaching out with long, skeletal hands. I screamed, but no sound came out, and in the blink of an eye, I found myself standing in the middle of a graveyard, surrounded by graves that were all marked with the name Evelyn. It was then that I realized the dollmaker had done more than just create her. He had given her his soul, his life force, binding her to him for eternity. But it wasn't just him that she had trapped. She had taken pieces of me too, and now she would never let me go. When I awoke in my own bed, drenched in sweat, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But when I looked at the shelf, Evelyn was still there, her eyes staring at me, her smile wide and knowing. And I knew, with an undeniable certainty, that she had already claimed me, just as she had claimed the dollmaker before me. She would never stop. She would never let go.